Wolverine 1,000 Mile boot is by far one of the most popular heritage style boots in the entire world, maybe only second to the Red Wing Iron Ranger in its popularity. And its name of 1,000 Mile boot's a pretty bold claim, so we're gonna cut this thing in half, see how it's built, see the materials, test them to really see if it's worth $400 and if it really is capable of lasting you 1,000 miles. And this is the start of the mid-range, mid-tier, made in America boot series. We're gonna take the top boots, all made in the United States, under $400, and compare them against each other to see who reigns supreme in the mid-tier boot range. And we're doing this because I love like the really high-end boots like Whites and Nicks and Vibergs, West Coast, all great boots, but sometimes it's a little bit inaccessible for a lot of people in that price range of $600 to $1,000. Let me know what other boots you want me to cut in this $400 and under price range. Welcome to the most relevant ad I've ever done on the channel. Thanks to Leather Honey for sponsoring this video. And you've probably heard of Leather Honey conditioner and cleaners because it's by far the most popular leather conditioner on Amazon. And it's not like Leather Honey's this new brand. They've been around since 1968. The thing I like about Leather Honey is it's a really natural, non-toxic leather conditioner because it doesn't have any solvents or silicone. Whenever family or friends inevitably ask me, what conditioner should I buy? How do I care for this leather product? How do I condition my leather couch? Leather Honey is one of the first ones I recommend because it's super easy to use, it's really affordable, it has a really long shelf life, you can basically get it anywhere, and most importantly, it's nearly impossible to screw up because it has a very honey-like consistency. You know, so you're not going to oversaturate certain areas, and it penetrates really deeply into the leather without leaving super dark like oil spots. So this pair of Danners put a layer on, and you can see it did darken it, but not nearly as much as a really heavy oil conditioner, but it didn't evaporate so much that you didn't actually condition your leather. And you can also see the difference on the Red Wings here. And Leather Honey understands the value of quality leather and the amount of money you invest in high quality leather goods. And they understand how important it is to keep your leather products looking as good as possible, but also to maintain them to make them last as long as possible. And Leather Honey has thousands and thousands of 5-star reviews, making it the #1 best-selling leather care product on Amazon. So see all the ways that Leather Honey cleaner and conditioner can prolong the life of your leather goods by clicking the link in my description, and use the code RoseAnvil20 at checkout to save 20% off your Leather Honey's complete leather care kit. So check them out below. Thanks again to Leather Honey. So now let's go over the history of Wolverine, because it's a pretty long history like a lot of these old school brands. So it started in 1883 when G.A. Krause founded a small leather tannery in Michigan. And he started producing work boots and gloves, and by 1903 Krause and his sons were producing over 300 boots a day in their new factory. And that factory that they built in 1903 is what brought electricity to Rockford, Michigan, where they're still located today. 1908 they opened a tannery. By the 1910s is when they really first started introducing the 1,000 Mile boot branding and started offering that 1,000 miles worth of wear guarantee. And then from 1916 to 1923, earnings increased 700%. So after that 1,000 Mile slogan was established, it really started to take off with people who were using them for work. And then they continued to grow over the next few decades, worked a little bit with the Navy in World War II, making some pigskin suede gloves. And then by 1964, they changed their name to Wolverine Worldwide.
And we're gonna call it Prestige Worldwide. Sounds so cool.
And then soon after, in 1965, they became a publicly traded company. Then from 1965 to 1980 is where you really start to see some of that corporate growth. They started new brands, they started acquiring companies. And in 1964, they started cat footwear by licensing the Caterpillar name, where we've cut apart some of their brands or some of their boots. 1997, they purchased Merrell. 1998, they acquired the Harley-Davidson global license. So some of these really terrible work boot brands that we've cut apart were made by Wolverine. They continued to purchase brands and build this corporate empire by purchasing Chaco, and they acquired the performance brands, which doubled the size of their company by adding Saucony, Keds, Stride-Rite, Sperry Topsiders, and they continued to grow and acquire more and more brands as they grow this giant footwear conglomerate. So it started out with its humble beginnings in the late 1800s, now up to this giant corporate conglomerate, purchasing brands, purchasing the rights to certain names, making all sorts of different quality footwear. And sometimes that's not always the best thing. So we'll see when we get this cut in half to see if they followed the path of a lot of corporations where they just use their name to sell a subpar product, or do they maintain the heritage and that 1,000 Mile that 1,000 Mile name. So let's start going through the details of this boot, starting with the leather, which is a really nice leather. It's one of my favorite leathers. It's a Horween Chrome XL. And if you don't know who Horween is, they're a tannery based in Chicago, Illinois, and they're one of the world's most famous tanneries. They might be the most well-known tannery, actually. And they're mostly known for their really saturated chrome tan leathers. Like Chrome XL and Cordovan, if you've heard those names, it's the Chicago-based Wolverine is really what popularized those leathers. And this leather is 2 millimeters thick, and it's on par with a lot of the heritage boots. Not quite as heavy duty as some of the Nicks and Whites and some of these work boot brands, but not quite as thin as some of these cheaper brands and the sneakers. And if we were to grade this leather, so we burned it first, and because there's so much oil infused into this leather and it's such a saturated leather, it actually took a really long time to burn the leather because you basically had to boil off all the compounds and oils inside the leather first. And as you can see, there's no plastic top coat. There's not a whole lot other than just leather and oil inside this leather. And if we look at the cross section of this leather, there is a lot of grain, but I believe they trim off just the very, very top of the grain to make sure that top layer of the leather is really even. It gets all the scars out and the bug bites to give you a really even and consistent leather. And as for the top coat and how they finish this leather, well, we've done a ton of these plastic finish, these really heavy pigmented finishes on sneakers recently, but it's been a while since we've done a true aniline finish leather. So if you don't know what aniline is, it's basically a wood stain but for leather. So instead of like this really heavy pigment on top that covers the natural characteristics and basically paints on top of the leather, aniline finishes are just a dye. So you still see a lot of that depth, you see a lot of the imperfections and a lot of the natural characteristics in the leather because you're not putting a layer of paint on top. This allows the leather to breathe easier, it allows it to absorb conditioning more, and it patinas really nicely because you get a lot of variation in the different colors. And more importantly, it doesn't flake off like a really heavy plastic coating and a really heavy pigmented finish. So that being said, I think this Chrome XL is an A-grade leather, but it does have its own pros and cons because of how saturated the leather is with oils and other tanning compounds. The pros are it has a really distinct smell. I love the smell of Chrome XL. Some people hate it, but I love it. It barely needs conditioning. It has lots of pull-up where you bend the leather and it changes color. And because there's so much oil, it almost naturally shines as you wear the boot. The cons being it scratches really, really easily, and because it's such a soft leather, it breaks in really quickly, so you get a lot of these rolls and these wrinkles that some people don't like. And the color can vary a lot from hide to hide and shoe to shoe, and you could buy 2 different pairs of boots from the same company, the same shoe, and it could be completely different colors because of how much Chrome XL can vary. And we also wanted to do a puncture test just to start adding some more information for this $400 American mid-tier boot range series we're doing, and it took 47.5 pounds to pierce through the upper. And then if we move to the midsole, this one's an easy one. You can see the midsole, it's just a big slab of veg tan leather because you can see it peeking through right here. Then if we go to the insole, there's no removable insole, but it does have a permanent leather sock liner. And the sock liner only goes halfway like most traditional boots do. And I believe it's a layer of Chrome XL, which is a nice touch. And you can also feel that there's a little layer of foam underneath the sock liner. And then as for the lining, it's a pigskin lining in the vamp only. There's nothing lining the quarters or the shaft of the boot. And pigskin makes a really good lining because it's so strong, it's so breathable for how thin it is. So it makes for like a nearly perfect lining leather. And then if we look at the outsole, we have a Vibram half sole on the forefoot, and then we also have a rubber Vibram top lift, and the top lift is a nice thick rubber top lift, so you have plenty of wear before you start wearing into the leather. And we put the durometer tester on this, and it came in at a 50 to 53 short A, so actually fairly soft compared to a lot of the other rubber that we've seen from Vibram, because if you look at a lot of the work boots we've done, it's up in that 70 to 80 short A range. This is a lot closer to what you see in sneakers. So it's going to be grippy, and it's going to give you a lot of squish underfoot, but it might not last as long as some of these harder outsoles. And they also have a leather soled version, like I have their Rawlings collab that's just a leather sole, and they just shorten the heel stack, and just basically you're standing on the midsole instead of having a half sole. But the leather soles are a lot more slippery than the rubber sole, so keep that in mind if you're deciding between the two. As for the heel stack, it looks like it's a full leather heel stack, but if you look really closely, this darker layer here isn't a natural slab of leather. What it is a reconstituted leather. So basically what they do is they take all the leather scraps, they grind it up, and then they bind it together with usually a rubber compound to make almost like an artificial leather heel block. So it acts a little bit like leather, it looks a little bit like leather, it's just not quite as nice as real leather. And it's not my favorite material. I'd way rather have it be full leather, especially for $100. But there's worse materials out there. I was just hoping that it would be full leather. And we also did an outsole puncture test, and it took 208.5 pounds to puncture through the outsole. And then finally to the construction. So this is a 360 Goodyear welted construction, and it's stitched all the way through the welt, the midsole, and the outsole You can see there. So this is a very traditional way of making a boot. So when it comes to a heritage boot, a Goodyear welt is one of the go-tos for the majority of people because it's super easy to resole. It's really strong because you're not just relying on glue. You've got all this stitching holding it together, and you can take it to a cobbler, and basically any cobbler can resole a Goodyear welted boot if they're a decent cobbler. And it just has that really traditional heritage boot look. So far it's looking pretty good for the Wolverine 1,000 mile boot, but it's what's on the inside that matters most, as your mother probably told you. So let's cut this thing in half and see what's on the inside. Okay, we got it cut in half. Let's see what's inside. So it's not as good as I'd hoped, but it's not all bad, it's not all good. There's some good, there's some meh, and there's some ugly. So for the good stuff, you've got a nice fiberglass shank. It gets you through the airport, it gives you support, it's nice and lightweight. You've got a cork filling layer that fills that void caused by the Goodyear welt. A lot of the cheaper boots will put foam in there. Cork's nice because it compresses, it's a natural material, it doesn't break down like foam does. And we can see that it is a true pigskin lining, which I really like. But as for the meh, the MEH, the internal counter cover is just a layer of suede. Suede's much better than fabric, but it's just not as good as like a rough out leather that still has that grain pattern in it. And the counter is a cellulose counter, so it's not as bad as a fragile plastic counter, but it's not quite as good as a leather or leather board counter. Then as for the bad, for 400 bucks, I would not want to buy a boot with a fiberboard insole, because fiberboard is just never going to be quite as durable as leather is. Like, go watch one of Trenton Heath's videos or Beato's Leatherworking. They tear apart boots like this all the time, and after they've worn them the 1,000 miles, that fiberboard just fractured and split because it's basically just paper compressed really hard together. So over time, those layers separate, it starts fracturing and splitting, whereas leather has that really tight fiber structure that you can't really get it to delaminate because all those fibers interlace. But fiberboard does have its place, especially in cheaper boots, because it is cheaper, it's easier to break in, it's more comfortable initially, but it's far from a heritage material. Then another bad thing is the sock liner. It's super weird because you've got this Chrome Excel sock liner like most heritage boots and most handmade boots have. And then I would have thought that this lining on the inside was the insole or the lasting board, but it's just a layer of pigskin. But the problem is it stops right where that sock liner begins. So you've got basically two half insoles and two half sock liners that overlap each other. And the problem with this is a lot of these sock liners, people have troubles with them because as you pull your foot out, sometimes you'll start pilling that sock liner up. Well, that problem's doubled with this boot, because the problem is if you start to have this heel sock liner start pilling up when you're pulling your foot out, when you start putting your foot in, this front sock liner could start pilling up as well. So you just, every time you put your foot in and out, it could be pilling up, and it's obnoxious. If you've ever had that happen, it's super annoying. And my pair of 1,000 mile boots, they haven't done that at all. Like, it's not peeling up at all, but it's just an annoying problem that didn't have to be there. It's kind of a lazy way of getting around making these boots as good as they could be, and they just created their own problem by making the sock liner this way. So to the big question, are they worth the price of $400? Well, they're not nearly as good as I thought they would be for $400. And I think you can find just as good a boots built in the exact same way for about $100 less. So just from a material standpoint, they are a little overpriced in my opinion. But there is a certain premium that you have to pay to get a US made boot that's all handcrafted in the United States. But I don't necessarily think that's where the premium comes from. I think the majority of the cost of this boot comes from the fact that it's this giant corporation that is publicly traded that has to make profits year after year. And so that means they have to increase margin, they have to sell more boots, they have to continue to grow, and a lot of times that ends up costing the consumer rather than the brand itself. And so I think that's what's happened with this boot, because for $100 less, you can get a Mexican-made boot built in the same way. For $100 more, you can get boots from like White's and Nick's and Westco that are right at that $500 price point for $100 more that doesn't have any of these issues and is built significantly better. And it's all made in the US by hand. So I do think they are overpriced, but also it is this like established brand. It's a really nice silhouette. It's a classic style. It's the 1,000-mile boot. So I don't think it's so overpriced that it should dissuade you from buying a pair, because I really like my pair. But just keep in mind that you're paying the corporate premium for these boots. And then to the final question, are they gonna last you 1,000 miles like the 1,000-mile boot name claims? I think they will last 1,000 miles, but it's a bit of a gamble because of the materials. Because I just don't trust this double half sock liner, and fiberboard just isn't nearly as durable as a leather insole. For the majority of people, I think it would last you 1,000 miles, but it's definitely not a guaranteed thing, and it's something that I wouldn't necessarily, if I made this boot built in this way, I wouldn't claim it as a 1,000-mile boot. And I find it kind of strange that they'd use words like authentic, hardworking, handcrafted, legacy, time-tested on a 1,000-mile boot that is built like a $200, $250 boot that might not last 1,000 miles. It's just a little bit disappointing from Wolverine. I thought for sure this would be worth the $400, but it's not. And to be honest, it kind of bums me out because I love this pair of boots and I thought that it was a little bit better built than what it actually was. So it does kind of take the shine off the Wolverine 1,000-mile boot for me. And that's a bummer. So Wolverine, just get rid of this junk, put some nice leather in there, then you'll have a real 1,000-mile boot, and you can still charge $400 for it, and it'd be a decent price. So let me know what you guys think and what other boots you want me to cut apart for this $400 under mid-range boot series. And also, if you have a name for this series, let me know, because I got to come up with a better name. But let me know what other boots you want us to cut apart and what you thought of this video. And thank you so much for your support of this channel. This fall is going to be so much fun. We have so many good boots lined up. It's going to be cool. So thank you guys. See ya.